episode, we'll be speaking to Stewart Pringle, who is the dramaturg at none other than the National Theatre. Stewart was previously a dramaturg at the Bush Theatre, the artistic director at the Old Red Lion, and his brilliant play Trestle was the winner of the Papatango Prize in 2017. So thanks for joining us today, Stewart. We're really thrilled to be speaking to you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Really excited about speaking to you today. So shall we sort of start at the beginning? Could you tell us a little bit about your background and how it all began and how you got into theatre?
Yeah, of course. So I grew up in the northeast of England, in a sort of small village in Northumberland, and I'd always loved acting, and had sort of done it from a reasonably young age. I guess my sort of love for theatre was really supercharged by a really brilliant teacher, as I think so many of us who got into theatre did, a brilliant drama teacher called Mike Fry, who used to take us on amazing trips, particularly to the Northern Stage. And so I saw a lot of, I suppose, Alan Lydiard's tenure at Northern Stage, where he was producing shows like Animal Farm and Clockwork Orange in 1984. I got really excited by that. Then went off to university and studied English literature. But while I was there, I got really into the theatre scene, I suppose. Acting at first and then directing, and then I guess after university the sort of my sort of most sensible option was, I think, probably to go into academia, and I did a master's and thought about it, but actually at the same time I was getting really increasingly excited and involved in the London theatre scene. Started by running a small theatre company with a couple of friends from university. We sort of specialised in doing sort of horror theatre and genre theatre, and we set up a thing called the London Horror Festival, which was like a festival of sort of horror and genre theatre. I sort of ran that company for about 4 or 5 years, while working all sorts of different jobs in London. And also at the same time, I was also trying to see as much theatre as possible. So I was also working a bit as a reviewer. I worked for Time Out, and I worked for The Stage and Exeunt. Did a lot of reviewing over about 5 or 6 years. And I guess that sort of all started leading me towards moving away from a sort of academic career and towards a theatre one. So I started my kind of professional theatre career, I suppose, by running the Old Red Lion. So I started working there in about 2014, I think, 2013 maybe. Ran that for 3 years, and then I guess my sort of interests increasingly coalesced into the literary side of it. So both writing plays, but also helping develop plays, working with playwrights, and that's when I moved across to dramaturgy and moved to the Bush Theatre. So that's kind of a very potted history of what I've been doing.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's really interesting. I think it's always interesting to hear how people kind of got into theatre and kind of into playwriting, and to working as a dramaturg as well, because I think there's not one kind of set route. So it's really interesting to hear about how all those kind of different paths can lead you into kind of so many different roles. And I think, like lots of people in theatre and playwriting, you seem to have a lot of strings to your bow, and you've done a lot of different roles there. And I was kind of interested to know kind of how they all kind of feed into each other. Do you find that kind of, do you have kind of just one passion, or is theatre the passion?
Well, I don't know. I suppose it all feels quite similar to me in that I suppose the way I always felt about it when I was sort of doing reviewing as well as trying to make theatre and all of that, was that it came from a similar sort of instinct, was that I really love theatre, but I really particularly love good theatre, I suppose, theatre that I find really exciting. And I suppose my passion's always been, whether writing whether writing for theatre or writing about theatre or working with writers in theatre, it's always been about making the work as exciting as it can possibly be. And hopefully developing something like kind of taste and judgment on what is exciting and what could be exciting. And I think it's in that way it all sort of coalesces. I suppose I think of myself as still an audience member first and foremost, and ultimately the decisions that I make when talking to writers, or the decisions I make if you're in a rehearsal room or sitting at my laptop, I'm still really thinking from that audience perspective of what do I want to see when the lights go down in that dark room that I've paid money to be in. And that kind of feels to me like it's always the primary urge, and everything's led towards that, I suppose.
Yeah, that's great. I think that would be really useful for some of the people who watch this, some people who members of London Playwrights, and emerging writers out there, to kind of, I think that's the key, isn't it? Kind of writing from the perspective of being an audience member. What do audiences want to see? I think if you can bear that in mind when, you know, through the lonely process of writing a play, I think that that's you know, that's a really valuable thing to hang on to, isn't it? And in terms of working with other writers, so, you know, you obviously work in terms of developing other writers in your role at the National, which we'll talk about a bit more in a minute, but does that kind of help you creatively as well in your own playwriting process?
Yeah, definitely. It's a hugely helpful to I guess spend as much time as you do if you're working as a dramaturg, thinking about structure and thinking about composition and things like that. And you, in my job, in my sort of day job at the National, you do end up spending a huge amount of time reading plays. Obviously, it's a big part of the job is reading and plays, watching workshops, watching readings, and as well as watching full productions. And that's always my first bit of advice to any playwright, really, is that you should read as much as possible, like read as many plays as you possibly can. I think both in terms of being inspiring, because you get to see what wonderful things other people are doing, you also get to see what you don't like and what doesn't work. And I think, you know, it's very hard to sort of dramaturg or critique your own work, but it does feed into the process, I think, of going, well, that was an incredibly exciting moment in that play, and that was the bit that really had me on the edge of my seat or whatever, and how can I bring that kind of feeling to an audience for my work? How can I find the same level of excitement or pathos or whatever in work that I'm making? So it is really helpful. I think it's also, there's a bad side to it as well, just in the fact that you can read plays that are just so intimidatingly brilliant that they make the blank page even scarier than it maybe otherwise would be. But in general, I think the very best thing you can do in whatever you do in theatre really is to get out and see work as widely as you can, by as diverse a range of voices as you can, and just to push yourself out of your own head, I guess. I mean, I think all writing has to come from the self and from personal experience to an extent, but the more new worlds you can plunge yourself into, the more rich that experience is going to be, I think, and the more hopefully textured and alive the work that you produce will be.
I think that's a great point, just kind of watching and reading as much as possible, and not necessarily things that are aligned with your kind of own artistic view as well, because I think that's key, and it's kind of opening your mind. It's easy to maybe just follow a particular genre and style that you kind of want to write in, but I think we often learn so much from reading that variety of scripts. And I know that when we get scripts come through to London Playwrights, it's just, as you say, sometimes it can be a bit intimidating, because some of the plays that I read, they're just so amazing and they're so far from what my own imagination could come up with. I find it really valuable, you know, that process of kind of reading. So talking about your job at the National, so can you tell us a bit about what your role there involves?
Yeah, so this is what I'm telling you is going to be what my role involved up until last March. The last year has been a sort of wild and strange year, and lots of things have changed and shifted. But the role, as was and as will be again, is essentially my job is to sort of find the stories and the artists who the National wants to platform and wants to produce, and bring those together. And it kind of extends all the way from first encountering an idea or an artist, seeing their work elsewhere, reading their work, encountering it somehow like that, then bringing them into the National, developing an idea with them, and then seeing that through all the way to, I guess, press night, really. And so the idea of a dramaturg in a setting like the National Theatre is essentially to work something like a literary manager, in that you're out there seeking work and you're looking at the programme and thinking about what should go on the stages, as well as a dramaturg working with the writer to develop their idea, working with the director, working in the rehearsal room to pull it all the way through to production. So it's quite a sort of expansive role, and there's a small team of us. I work with Nina Steiger, who's the head of play development at the National Theatre, as well as with Emily McLaughlin, who's actually leaving us soon, but she's been head of new work at the National for some time. And I work within the new work department, which is, because the National is such a large organisation, it has basically an entire building dedicated to developing new work. And that's where my office is, and it's there that we engage every writer that the National Theatre works with. It's where we workshop every play the National Theatre develops. And it really is like, it's just on the cut next to the Old Vic, and it really is a sort of tiny little hub of everything that's new that's happening at the National, as well as work that might go elsewhere in the country, and even internationally. It's the engine room that kind of powers the creative conversations at the National Theatre. And my job really there is to do whatever is required creatively for whatever project. So on some projects, it might just be popping in and listening to a reading and giving some notes. On other projects, it might be sitting in every workshop, every rehearsal, and helping guide and shape the process. And in some projects, it might be just sitting with a composer or a writer in a room and talking through their ideas and drawing out their ideas. So yeah, that's kind of just a few of the many things that we end up doing. And a lot of it obviously is about also, sort of getting away from my desk and going out and seeing work and getting on a train and going to other cities, or getting on, playing and seeing work in other countries, and bringing all of that stuff and all of those connections and artists and concepts into a conversation at the National that might lead to work being developed or work being pushed further.
It's really, really fascinating to hear that, and to hear how it all works. The idea of this hub there at the National and kind of dealing with new work in this way, because I think as an emerging writer, when you send your work out, you kind of imagine, you picture this person at their desk, you don't know who they are, you imagine them with a mountain of plays, and you don't kind of maybe picture the longer kind of process of that. So it's kind of really, really fascinating to hear about how that all works. And one of the things, when I was having a look at kind of what you do and, your job at the National, it was interesting to see that distinction between, the job title of literary manager or dramaturg. And I was quite interested in that distinction. So is it because you do kind of stay involved in that process up and with the writer and help them to develop?
Yeah, so the kind of distinction between literary manager and dramaturg is kind of one that's quite contested, I suppose. And it's partly an issue of what we call a literary manager and what we call a dramaturg, a nomenclature question. It's also a question of what their role is within the organisation. I think if you'd gone to the National 20 years ago, you'd have found a literary department with a literary manager who probably wouldn't have considered themselves a dramaturg or wouldn't have had that in their title. But their role would have been very similar. It would still have been to receive plays, to make judgment calls about plays, and then to help develop those plays towards the stages. The kind of idea of dramaturg, as it's been heavily influenced obviously by traditions within mainland Europe, as well as traditions developing within America, and I think has become increasingly central to the kind of practice of play development in the UK. But it's often, I guess, almost a false distinction when if you look at a theatre which has a literary manager. Such as the Donmar Warehouse, say, Claire Slater at the Donmar is just as much a dramaturg as anyone at the National Theatre or anyone at the Bush Theatre. The activity is very similar. I suppose the significance of calling someone a dramaturg rather than having them as a literary manager is that it sends out a message about their involvement and their ongoing involvement in the process of play development, as well as just selection. I think there's maybe an idea kind of you're alluding to there, I suppose, of the literary manager as being someone who sits with 2,000 scripts in front of them and reads them very slowly, and then passes one or two of them up to the artistic director. And that I think that can feel quite gatekeepy, and it can feel quite almost kind of a kind of gladiatorial situation for writers to be going into. And I think the idea of moving things towards the idea of a dramaturg is that it becomes more of a question of an artistic collaborator with those writers. And obviously there is still a selection of a process of selection and winnowing down a large selection of plays, but it isn't really as simple as someone pulling scripts off a pile. At the National, we're very fortunate to have a brilliant senior reader, Dipo Barua Eti, he is the person who manages all of the submissions from I guess unrepresented writers, or writers who don't send their plays via their agent to us. He receives something like 1,500 plays a year, and he doesn't read all of those himself. He has a team of freelance readers who read and report to him and meet regularly to discuss the work they see. But he then has a part to play in championing that play to the next level, in that play finding its way into other hands and a higher level of consideration. And it's really only when we think a play or a writer is really exciting that the dramaturgs would then get involved with beginning that relationship. So I guess Dipo and his reading team are the kind of the pull the script off the pile and read it and write a report on it side of things. And the dramaturgs at the National are much more on the question of, okay, this is exciting, let's get this writer in and let's start the process of working with them. And it's a long process, as I was sort of alluding to. It's very rare that the National Theatre will meet a writer and produce any of their work within the first 2 or 3 years of having met them. Usually it's quite a measured process, and it will begin with a conversation, which will then hopefully lead to us giving them a little bit of time to come into the National and work with us on attachment, and from there could lead to a commission for a new piece of work or an adaptation or whatever. But even then, the play will probably have a year or two of development, workshops, readings, script edits and changes to go through before it finds its way onto the stage. So the process is lengthy, and that's part of the reason that we have a sort of dedicated team of dramaturgs who are there to look at, there are roughly 100 shows in development at the National Theatre at any given time. And that's not even including the ones which are being kind of written on attachment or kind of speculative commissions. There are sort of 100 plays in active development. And the dramaturgs are there to shepherd them through that process and to try and ensure that by the time they get to the point where a decision has to be made to programme them, and for them to become one of the 20 odd plays every year that we produce at the National, they're in the very best possible state, and that we can be there to assist Rufus, the artistic director, and Clint, the deputy artistic director, to make the very best decisions about the programme, and have, ultimately our job is to stock the larder with as sort of enticing and exciting a range of foods as possible that they can then choose from. And and that's a long process that requires a kind of collaborative and trusting relationship between dramaturg and writer and director and the rest of the team.
Oh, wow, it's just amazing to hear about that process, because I think that when writers submit, I think firstly the idea of submitting to the National is probably quite daunting to a lot of very new writers, and even writers who perhaps had work on it, from the Fringe and self-produced and things like that. I think the idea of submitting to the National is like, wow, okay, that's quite a bold move. So it's quite interesting to hear how long that process then is between submitting and being selected, and then kind of having that relationship kind of nurtured and developing your script to a point where it is ready to kind of go on stage. I think that's it's quite nice to hear how kind of supportive that is, but also I can see why it's such a long process. I can imagine it's probably unheard of or very rare, this idea that you might send your script in your very first play and it's picked up by a reader who says, yeah, let's put this on at the National. That's not kind of how it works. It is a much kind of longer process.
Yeah, absolutely, and it really is, and that has basically never happened. I mean, there are some first-time plays which have gone on at the National. Plays like Nine Night and Hansard were both essentially first plays by their writers. Their writers were established actors and had been working in the industry for a time before that. But yeah, we're not really, when you send your play into the National Theatre, you're not really sending it there so that we'll produce that play, although it can sometimes feel like it. What you're sending it there is to put yourselves on our radar and to start a conversation, really. And the conversation is unlikely to start when we've just read one play by you, unless it's utterly stunning. What we're probably really going to do, if we love a play that you send in, is start a conversation with you and read more work, try hopefully see some of your work in production, get to know it. Because if you've got essentially all the writers in the country and some internationally kind of interested potentially in working at the theatre, and you've only got 20 plays that you can stage every year, you've got to be really sure that the process that you start with a writer is going to be one that's fruitful for you, and that you're going to get plays from them that are producible, but also for them, in that it's going to help their career and not hinder it. It's not going to bend it out of shape or send it in a strange direction. So really, the part of what we're doing as a team of dramaturgs and team in the new work department is kind of holding in our heads and also on spreadsheets the names of all of the writers in the country who we're excited about, and we're sort of tracking them. And when I get sent a play which I think is really exciting, it makes it doubly likely that I'll engage and go and see their next play, whether that's at the Royal Court or whether that's at Volts Festival or anywhere else. It will start there. It will mark them as a writer of interest, and that's someone we will probably follow for a while before we bring them right in. And most writers who we're engaging on attachment are writers whose work we've been reading over a period of years, usually, before they get to a point, because we're not, unlike say the Royal Court, which has a dedicated writer development program, we're not really interested in developing writers at the National, not developing their craft. I mean, that will happen hopefully through their relationship with us, but we're looking for writers who are quite a long way down that development process already, who found their voice, who are also starting to write towards not bigger scale in terms of number of characters, but bigger scale in terms of scale of ideas and depth, I suppose. So we're very rarely looking for that. I've written one play, it's my first play, I'm a promising young writer. We're very rarely looking to start a conversation with that person. We probably want to talk to them in a couple of years' time when they've written a few plays and they're moving from being a promising new writer to being a crafts person who's got experience of going through a play rehearsal process, development process, production process, because it's extremely rigorous at the National. Obviously, is it all theatres, but I mean the level of kind of complexity and rigor that goes into the production process. So it's sort of always worth sending it, but it's also important to know that you're not buying a lottery ticket because it's not just, there isn't just one prize, and the prize isn't we'll just produce this play. That's just not really how it works, although it can sometimes feel like that. And that's more or less true for most theatres. There aren't very many theatres who produce plays that are just sent to them and instantly. It's usually a process of discussion and development of the writer, because ultimately we're a building that wants brilliant plays, but more than anything, we're a building that wants brilliant writers, because we want it to be a sort of lengthy and sort of fruitful and an exciting relationship with that writer and the building.
Yeah, because actually the pressure as well would be so immense, wouldn't it, if you sent off this first play to the National and they picked it up, produced it, then where would you go from there almost if you were so new to it? Because the pressure would be just ridiculous to kind of deliver something of that standard again. So I think it's quite encouraging to hear that that it is such a long process in that way, and that it isn't a lottery. You can't, if you're a writer and you haven't been that writer who sent their first play off to somewhere big, and then it's been produced and you've become this star, that everyone's talking about. I think for writers who, the vast majority of writers, this is the case, who haven't done that, it's really encouraging to hear that actually it is a long process and you can carry on, and you can do that. You can go down the self-producing route, you can keep writing, and you can, even if you haven't been picked up by the National and you haven't sent your play there yet, you can keep going and gaining that experience, because it's also valuable. It's not necessarily about just writing that fantastic script straight away and having it produced.
And that's the case for most of the kind of big name writers out there. They grafted for a long time. They either self-produced or had their plays produced in small rooms and theatres above pubs and places like that, until their sort of canonical works started. And I mean, there are so many writers who we're working with now, whose work we first encountered, at Theatre 503 or at the Old Red Lion or even Volts Festival. I mean, and there are also writers who we're engaged with who've never had anything produced, but have written 4 or 5 really exciting plays, or even 2 or 3 really exciting plays that we've read and gone, look, you're something amazing. And the fact you haven't been produced yet is mad, but we're certainly gonna work with you and work on trying to change that. So I mean, it's not about youth. It's not about your first play. There are writers who write their first play and it explodes, and then everyone's looking at them and it's huge momentum, and that's amazing. But that's a tiny minority of the people who are working to make a career as a writer. Most people are grafting. Most people are sending out half a dozen plays before they get that one that earns them a meeting. And I mean, it is, to use a cliche, it is a marathon and not a sprint. And there's certainly no barrier to entry at the National Theatre that is you've written too many plays before your big hit, or that you're too old to write your first big play, or whatever. It can come at any stage in a writer's career, and also you can kind of reach the point of being ready to engage with larger theatres in a huge variety of different ways.
Yeah, that's really kind of great to hear, and that it is about keeping going. I just think that's quite inspiring, really. And to almost ignore that when you do see the debut play from such and such, when actually, as you said, it's a really good point, it's probably not really their debut play as such. They've probably written 5, maybe 10 plays before, and they've been working in the background. It's just the first play that we've seen on a big stage or something like that. So I think that's really, really great to hear. Obviously, you've said that scripts are sent to the National and they're dealt with kind of by a reading team, but you're also as well, in addition to that, are you out there watching theatre and, you know, finding new writers in that way as well? So they're not just coming to you through this one stream of.
No, not at all. Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different streams. There's also, I mean, in addition to plays which are sent to me by the senior reader who says this is exciting, there are also plays that reach us by agents. We have a kind of ongoing relationship with every agency, really, and personal relationships with the individual agents there, who we talk about what kind of writers we're looking for, kind of plays we're excited by, and they send us stuff as and when. But yeah, also in normal times, everyone on our team goes out to the theatre 2 or 3 nights a week at least. And that's not just theatres in London, that's also theatres across the country as and where we can. We have a meeting every Friday morning where we all get together and we talk about all the shows we've seen in the last week and what was good and what was bad. And then we also talk about what we're going to go and see the next week, and we plan it all out. And artists and playwrights and artists of all kinds can send invitations into the New Work department. There's a bit on the website where you can invite us to come and see your shows. We're not going to come and see everything. We're much more likely to go and see something that's running for a few weeks and something that's on for a couple of nights. But we do go and see as much work as we possibly can. And you know, at Vaults Festival, we'll see 40 or 50 shows. At the Edinburgh Fringe, I'll personally see 40 shows over the period of a week or two that we're up there. And we'll all be coming together to discuss them and to kind of talent spot. And you know, that every time there is an Edinburgh or a Vaults or whatever, it puts writers on our list. And it might put writers on our list to invite straight in, or it might put writers on our list to keep watching or ask to read their new play or whatever. But it's a constant process of seeing work as well. And I personally am very committed to getting out of London as much as possible to see work, because I'm not from London, and the idea that London was the only place that good theatre was made was never part of sort of my universe. I saw, you know, most of the theatre that got me excited was in Newcastle or in Leeds, or in Doncaster or in Edinburgh or whatever. You know, I was seeing, you know, you're seeing work nationally, and it's a national theatre, and really I hugely encourage particularly playwrights who are not based in London and who have relationships with theatres outside of London to make sure you do invite us, because it's so important, I think, particularly when we reopen, that the National Theatre is seeing work nationally, and not just seeing work, but also finding ways to support it and bring artists in from not just within, you know, within London.
I mean, that's really great to know, because I think, you know, over the last year, our kind of the people who are following kind of London playwrights, that's kind of really widened. I know London is in our title, but as it's all online, you know, we're really accessible to everyone all over the country, and not even in the UK at the moment as well. But I think that outside of London, there is that kind of feeling that, you know, to submit your play to the National, or to invite someone from the National to come and see your work. Someone might, you know, an emerging writer who's putting a play on somewhere else might actually feel, oh, it's pointless inviting someone from the National because they won't come, or it's pointless inviting someone from London because they're not going to come all that way. So that's just really great to have that message out there, that it is the National Theatre, and that you should invite.
Yeah, and also, again, a bit like sending in the plays. I mean, I remember when the National came to see a play that I wrote in about 2012 or something like that. I was terrified because the National were coming, and also really excited, and was just like, well, that's it then. They'll just put it on. I mean, once they see this, they'll just put it on. Obviously, they didn't. Obviously, I didn't hear from them afterwards, but your name's still going on a list. It's still going, it's still planting in people's heads. They're getting to know you as a writer. So it's always worth inviting us. We won't always be able to attend. And when we do attend, we won't necessarily bang you an email straight away and go, come in for a chat. But we'll be, if we loved it, we'll be that much more likely to make that call at a later date, or to read more of your work, or just to see more of your work. Because it is just all about constantly searching and sifting and discussing what is exciting and what's exciting that's being made. And you know, that's the joy of the job, really. I mean, I can't think why anyone would want to work in theatre if they didn't genuinely love going to different theatres and seeing a really wide range of work. And one of the thrilling things, I mean, about London being so sort of populous with theatre makers, is that more or less every single week when we go to our shows meeting on a Friday, we find a new theatre, never mind a new writer. There's almost always a theatre that we've never heard of that's just popped up, and you know, it's incredible the amount of work that's being made, and really exciting. And we do we don't just see work at the Royal Court and the Bush. We do go to the pub theatres and the smaller pop-up theatres if the work there sounds exciting, and if the writers there and directors there sound promising and ambitious.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think lots of people do ask, like, who should I invite to my Fringe production, and will people come to see it if you invite people from the industry and things like that. So it's actually really good to hear it out loud that yes, you should, and it's really valuable to do that, even if you don't hear from them immediately afterwards or even at all. But it just kind of gets your work out there, doesn't it, and allows you to kind of share it. So the last year, I bet that's really kind of changed your kind of working week, in a sense, if you can't get out to the theatre. So I bet you're kind of itching for everything to open again.
I've tried to see as much as possible, both online and physically when it was sort of possible. I think I saw pretty much everything that opened in real life. When everything started opening last summer, I went and saw 2 puppet shows in an outdoor picnic setting in Islington, because I was so keen to see new work. But yeah, we're really excited about everything reopening and getting back to something like normal, but we're also aware that it's going to take a long time, and we're also so aware of the amount of talent that has left the industry, or that has had to take a pause in the industry. So yeah, it feels really key to try and work out what we can do to support artists and to make sure that we're still seeing work and forging those relationships, because what we don't want is to have a kind of 1-year gap in which, like, we just didn't get to see anyone new or find anything new. So we have all mostly been working through the whole period, and we've still been reading, we're still receiving scripts and reading them and discussing them, and we've got a big list of writers who we want to engage when we can reopen the doors and get out there. But yeah, it's been strange. We're not having an Edinburgh, we're not having a Vaults festival, and these things that you sort of have in your year as sort of marker points. Not having them has been really peculiar, but it's been amazing watching some of the work that's been created for Zoom and that's been created digitally. I mean, I've seen as much as I could, and also interactive work, and it was really inspiring to see how quickly companies turned around, or artists turned around and started finding new ways to engage with audiences. And I sort of don't feel like there's any pressure on anyone to have made anything over the last 18 months or to have written anything. But it's brilliant when people have managed to find that emotional capacity and that sort of mental capacity to keep making work in this time. Because I mean, personally as a writer, I found it incredibly difficult to work in this period. Having a bit of extra free time, which I always swore would, be the key, has not been the key whatsoever. And it turns out that actually getting out and living in the world and seeing work is just as important as having time to sit at your laptop. I think we won't take that for granted again.
In terms of I think you've kind of answered this in a lot of ways. It sounds like no one day is the same for you. What's your kind of, what does a normal day kind of look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, there is no such thing really in terms of the job. It can be a huge variety of things. The kind of most likely combination of things it will be is a certain amount of time reading scripts, a certain amount of time meeting with writers or directors and talking about work, a certain amount of time watching a workshop or a reading and participating in that and talking into that, and then a certain amount of time on a train going to a theatre somewhere and watching a show and reporting back. But yeah, the days are hugely varied, and there's a certain amount of set things within the week. There are meetings that we have internally and things like that about to discuss work or to discuss what's happening within the studio building. But then it's, just as often it'll be about getting up to Covent Garden to watch a reading, or it's about going up to Edinburgh to watch a show or something else. So it really is a really big variety. It's probably the thing I kind of love most about the job, I suppose, is that no 2 days are the same, and there's a real freedom, I think, in every organisation I've worked in. There's a freedom and autonomy to be able to manage your own schedule and also manage your own approach to doing the job. I mean, no 2 projects are the same, never mind 2 days, in that some shows will go up and they need very little interaction from the dramaturgs at all. Others are essentially like pulled together by those dramaturgical voices, and it completely depends on the artists involved and what they want, really. Ultimately, the job is to find the work, find the stories, and find the artists, put the things on the stages, but the route to that is completely up for grabs and changes all the time.
What about your own writing? Do you have to kind of squeeze that in? When do you find time for that? You sound very full on what you're doing.
Well, I mean, sort of fortunately, I suppose, I've always ended up writing quite quickly, but it sort of takes me a very long time to think of something to write and also to put the ideas together in my head, and usually on the notes app on my phone. And then actually the process of writing a draft usually it only takes about a week or so. But I usually do that quite intensively. I either go and stay with family or rent a cottage or something like that and just go and get away from it and write it. And then redrafting and everything like that has to happen around work hours. But I know everyone's different, but I can't get home from a full day at work at 7 p.m. and start writing a new play. It's just not the way my head works. I need to decompress and can't just throw myself into that. So it's always been about getting away, getting to a different environment, somewhere where I'm not kind of still in the kind of dramaturg work mode, so I can kind of get a draft written. So I try and do that a couple of times a year, really.
Otherwise, sometimes I think, when you try and squeeze things in around your job and, you end up, your own writing gets put to the bottom of the pile and you're just kind of squeezing it in there. So I think that intensive writing period sounds really valuable. So you obviously spend a lot of time reading scripts and seeing plays as well. What do you think makes a good script?
The kind of the term I've used most, or the term I sort of feel is most appropriate, is sort of wholeheartedness, I suppose. Like, the National Theatre is a big space. All of the theatres in it are large. None of them are the size of the Royal Court upstairs. Now that we don't have the shed, none of them are even the size of a sort of mid-scale theatre. They're all large buildings. And they need stories which have which can touch a lot of people at the same time, which are expressive and clear and engaging and exciting and moving, and are doing those things for a large audience. It doesn't mean that the stories have to be universal, because I don't know what that means, but it does mean that stories have to speak in a language which is intelligible to a lot of people and move them at the same time. I mean, I think that's where I'm really looking for. I'm looking for a writer who can tell an amazing story and who can tell it in a way which it can speak to a lot of people. I think we do more experimental work from time to time, and we're sort of the UK home for amazing playwrights like Annie Baker, who write work which I suppose is on the experimental end of things. We stage work by Martin Crimp, by Carol Churchill, but we do also, in the majority, we try and create work which is as expressive and as affecting for a large audience as we possibly can. So, I mean, what I look for in a script is a brilliant story, brilliantly told. And I know that's perhaps not the most specific thing, but that's because ultimately there is no answer to what a National Theatre play looks like, or what a good National Theatre play looks like. All you can say is that what we're looking for is stories of the highest quality, told extremely well, and told in a way which can communicate to an audience of 800 plus people, for 5 or 6 or 7 weeks. It's a big ask. It needs a robust play. It needs a play with real bones and muscle on those bones, and it usually requires a really developed craft and a real ability to manage the expectations of such a sort of extensive period of exposure to a large audience. So I mean, when I sort of compare it to maybe the work I was doing at the Bush Theatre or the Old Red Lion Theatre, where we had smaller auditoriums, I think when I was at the Bush, often we maybe talk about the kind of originality of the voice and the surprisingness of the voice, or the kind of uniqueness of the form might be enough to create an exciting theatrical moment. If you're playing in a small studio and you're only playing for a few weeks, you can kind of ride by on that energy. The play still needs to be brilliant, but it can maybe have a little less muscle on its structure. In these huge auditoriums, that would be really exposing for that play. So they need to have a kind of a robustness. And we're also looking for people who are writing with scale. And scale does not mean there's 30 people on the stage. Scale means the idea is big. The idea resonates. So we're always looking for examples of that in a writing. Like, a writer's not going to knock out Amadeus and send it into us as their first, second, or third play or whatever. But we are going to find things within their writing, things within the way they tell a story, which suggests that they have an ambition to essentially put their characters on that huge, big, wide open, expansive stage and speak out in a way which is intelligible and moving to as many people as possible.
And do you think that writers should kind of bear that in mind before submitting to the National, or do you think that, you know, if they think they've got a really polished play that is the best, you know, that they can, really worked hard on it, do you think that they should kind of bear in mind, is it suitable for those bigger stages and bigger audiences before they submit?
No, not really, because we're probably not going to stage that play. I mean, we're probably going to start a conversation with them about what play they might want to write for the National. I think the very worst thing for writers to do would be to go, I'm going to write my National Theatre play and send it into unsolicited submissions. That might teach them something about writing a play on a large scale, but it's probably not going to result in that play being produced. They should write the thing that they want to write the story they want to tell, and write it in a way that it can be produced by more than one or two theatres in the country. I think there's a sort of myth that the National is looking for huge historical dramas all the time, and we're actually not. If we are going to do a huge historical drama, we'll probably commission a huge historical drama from someone who's written huge historical dramas before. We're looking for people to send something that like blows us away with the originality, the excitement of its storytelling, the voice from a community or perspective that we haven't heard before. That's much more likely to sort of get us excited. And we take as many meetings because we've read brilliant duologues and monologues as we do because we've read brilliant 80 character historical epics. I mean, we do more meetings for the duologues and monologues because they're probably going to be better. I think people don't need to try and write the National Theatre play before they send it into the National Theatre. They should write the play that they want to write. And then if we like it, then we'll start writing the National Theatre play with them. And
do you think there are any kind of common pitfalls that new writers fall into when submitting their work?
Not really. I mean, I think misunderstanding what we mean by scale is the biggest one, and not to put people off. People want to write huge epics, they absolutely should, but be realistic about where's going to stage that and how. I think is worth it. Like, I do think you have to have a bit of nous as a writer about what you're creating and where is it likely to be performed. I don't think it's a mistake. I don't think it's a mistake entirely, because I think everything you write is valuable, but I do think it's sometimes an error to write something that can only be produced at the National Theatre or the RSC when you haven't had a play on at Volts Festival yet, because I think you'll learn more by getting a play which is producible out there and produced than you will by hacking your way through a 4-hour epic, really, because actually it's extraordinarily difficult to write those huge 4-hour epics, and very few people are any good at it. And maybe you're the one who is, but what you're more likely to find is that your storytelling ability and your talent and your voice is going to end up sort of scraped over too much bread, basically, and you'd be much better off condensing, boiling it down into something. I mean, all I'd say is that don't try and second guess what we're looking for, and also what we're looking for is a brilliant storyteller. At the end of the day, a brilliant storyteller who is clearly developing in their craft and is pointing themselves towards an ability to write stories for large audiences. I mean, there are simple pitfalls, like don't send in a radio play and tell us it's a play. Don't send in a screenplay and just take out the scene indicators. Like that will not help, and it won't encourage us to read more of your work. I'd say a common pitfall is probably don't send. I mean, I think we're about to actually change our criteria and ask people to only send 1 play a year, but it's generally not worth sending us 5 plays at once. Like if you've got 5 plays that you think the National should be reading, probably just pick the best one and make us read that, and then maybe the second best. But I think like quality is more important than quantity, obviously, and just don't try and direct your play on the page to the Olivier Theatre. You're much better off just telling the story.
Thank you. I think there's some really, really fantastic advice in there for new writers. What about people wanting to work in a literary department or as a dramaturg? Would you have any tips for that too?
I mean, the best tip is, as I said with everything in theatre, is just try and see as much work as possible. And I mean, I couldn't afford to do that when I moved to London, which is why I started reviewing. I didn't start reviewing because I wanted to be a journalist. I just wanted to get some theatre tickets. And I do think that that's not a bad place to start if you want to work in literary departments. Not because being a critic is a kind of useful path in, but just because you'll get to see work, loads of work. And if you can find a way to maybe, whether it's to become a literary associate or an artistic associate of a building and get that experience equally, that can be really helpful. I think becoming a script reader is probably one of the key ways to start that process. You probably need to read plays for free initially, but there'll probably be perks that come with it. Places like 503 and the Park, I think, have reading panels who maybe don't get paid, but they'll get free tickets to see shows there, and there'll be other benefits. And once you've done a couple of years of that in your spare time, then you might be able to get some paid work as a script reader, whether it's at the National or the Royal Court or the Bush or somewhere, and then kind of go from there. But there are all sorts of different ways in, and I mean, when we were, say, hiring for our last time we hired a new position, which was for our senior reader, we had applicants who did all sorts of things. Really, the most exciting thing was bringing people into the literary department who had a range of different experiences inside and outside of theatre, and who looked like they'd bring a really unique perspective. I mean, I sort of think the main thing that literary departments are looking for when they hire people is taste. Like, they want people who've got really good taste in work. Because if I've got a senior reader, or if I've got a reader whose taste I don't trust, then it doesn't really matter how many what qualifications they've got or what masters they did in dramaturgy. It doesn't really matter. I've got to trust that when they read something, they'll see not necessarily the same things in it as me, but they'll see quality and they'll see lack of quality, and they'll be able to talk about it and in a critically engaged way. So I think whatever you can do to expose yourself to as much work as possible, and also literary departments are looking for people who've got practical experience of working on plays. So you probably want to try and find yourself some work. If not as a dramaturg on a show, then at least being able to observe a show being created and put together. If I was trying to start as a dramaturg now, I think I'd go to Vaults Festival or go to the Edinburgh Festival or whatever, see as much work as I possibly could, and then get in touch with the companies who worked I loved and go, I would love to sit in your next rehearsal room for a bit. Maybe I could get into a conversation about what you're making next or whatever, and find your way in by working with people who you think are brilliant, and then you're already demonstrating your ability to pick a winner, basically, and you're demonstrating your taste and your ability to find and support exciting work.
Yeah, that's really useful advice there. So I think the kind of upshot is, to get yourself out there and keep reading work and keep seeing theatre and just getting involved in work where you can. Well, thank you, Stuart. It's been a really great conversation today. It's been fantastic speaking to you.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.